Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, you may be asking yourself right now, what's he doing reacting to this video? He already did a reaction to this video. If you're new to the channel, you might not know that. But if you've been around for a while, you probably know that one of the very first reaction videos I ever did, back when I only had hundreds of subscribers instead of hundreds of thousands of subscribers, was this reaction video to the American Civil War. But in time, as I've looked back on that very first set of reactions I did, I've learned a lot about how to do reaction videos better. That original one, I talked over it a lot. I didn't pause, and so sometimes it's hard to hear what I'm saying or what the original video is saying. And for me personally, it's just a little bit cringy and not my best work. So I've decided to take that down and replace it with this one. For anybody in the future who might join the channel, I wanted to have better quality for you to watch. So I'm going to be redoing this two-part series reacting to Oversimplified's American Civil War. So welcome if you're new to the channel, and I hope you enjoy this. Of all of the areas of history that I've studied over the past 30 plus years, the American Civil War is the one that I feel most confident in calling myself an expert. I've got 200 to 300 books just in my own personal library here at home on the American Civil War. I probably read anywhere from 10 to 15 books on the Civil War every year. I've studied it for hours and hours and hours every year that I've been involved in history. I've done research into hundreds of individual American Civil War soldiers at the National Archives through pension files and military records. It's just something I'm very, very passionate about. So I'm excited to dive back into this. I've also put links in the descriptions, not only to the original content creator. Make sure you go over and support Oversimplified. They've got some of the best and most entertaining historical content on YouTube. But I've also put a link in the description to all of my other reactions to Oversimplified videos. So you can check those all out in one place. I'm going to go ahead and dive right into this. I hope you enjoy it. Please don't forget to check out the original content creator. Hit that like button and subscribe to this content if you like it. And also check out my merch store. I'm wearing some of the latest merch, the Vlogging Through History logo that I just got yesterday in the mail. Let's dive into part one.
Made possible by NordVPN. Click the link down below to get 70% off an annual subscription, plus an additional month free. Also, stun your friends, turn heads, get compliments. Buy yourself some Oversimplified merch today, along with a very honest new character pin. Link in the description down below. Okay, Mrs. Lincoln, this is it. One last push, and we're done. 9 months and 4 days ago, my father brought forth upon my mother himself, and gave to her a child, conceived in a shack in Kentucky, and dedicated to the proposition that I will drink num-nums from a bottle, do little poo-poos in my pantses for the next 2 to 3 years. Now what does it babies do again?
So, you know, it's kind of funny that he starts it this way. I'm not entirely sure why he did that. And actually, the Napoleonic Wars Oversimplified that just came out in the last couple of weeks has a very similar intro to this. And it's kind of an homage to the Gettysburg Address, 7 years ago. Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, that whole thing. But it's also an important reminder, you know, sometimes with historic figures, we give them this godlike status, this mythological status, and we forget that they were human beings. Abraham Lincoln was a human being who was a kid, who grew up, and who went through hardship, and went through a lot of hardship in his early life.
Oh yeah. I am not touching that. Abraham Lincoln grew up with his relatively poor family in Kentucky, eventually moving to Indiana, and finally, Illinois. He read a lot of books, worked a lot of jobs, wrote some questionable poetry, and finally entered the law profession.
So he kind of skips through a lot of Lincoln's early history. Lincoln's mother died fairly young. His mother's name was Nancy Hanks Lincoln, and he's actually a distant cousin of the actor Tom Hanks. They're related through the Hanks family. His mother died fairly young, and no, she wasn't killed by vampires and putting Lincoln on a lifelong quest to destroy vampires because of it. He didn't get along real well with his father, Thomas Lincoln, who was kind of a difficult man. There are pictures of Thomas Lincoln that were taken back in the early days of photography. Lincoln's stepmother, I think Sarah Bushrod Lincoln was her name, actually outlived him. She died a few years after he was assassinated. And yeah, they moved around a lot, very poor farmers. end up in Illinois eventually. But Lincoln has largely a self-educated early couple of years and a couple of decades in his life. Teaches himself all he can. Doesn't go to college or anything like that, but does enough to be able to practice law.
Despite being self-taught, he turned out to be a pretty clever and astute lawyer. In one case, a guy claimed he witnessed a murder at night, and
Batman
Lincoln was like,
on the
"How could
wall.
you have seen anything in the dark? There was a bright full moon." A what? A bright full moon. Can you say that again, please? There was a bright full moon. A dim half moon? No, a bright full moon. That's funny, because according to this almanac, there was a dim half moon that night, which makes you a liar. Well, I got a bright full moon for y'all right here. Now that's what I call a rebuttal.
Oh boy. That's a dad joke right there.
Lincoln and his cheekbones weren't only interested in law, however. He also dabbled in the world of politics, serving as a legislator in both local and national assemblies. And what a time it was. Not even 100 years after the Founding Fathers wrote, "All men are created equal," politicians were already asking, yeah, but what does that mean exactly?
So, kind of, again, glosses over some of Lincoln's early political history. Yeah, he does serve in the Illinois legislature, but he also served one term in the U.S. House of Representatives as a congressman. And in his one term in the House of Representatives, he was very outspoken against the Mexican-American War. And that was not that uncommon. People like Ulysses S. Grant, who fought in the Mexican War, were very opposed to it. Just felt like it was basically aggression by the U.S. government to take territory, which is what it was. We wanted Texas and the Southwest. So he speaks out against it. He serves just the one term, goes back to Illinois, goes back to practicing law, and it's only in the 1850s that he starts to rise to national prominence in politics.
It means all men. Yeah, but what does that mean exactly? And not just that. States' rights versus the federal government. What are the executive powers of the president? Is cereal a soup? The Founding Fathers left some of these questions perhaps a little too open to interpretation.
Yeah, and honestly, the whole two-party system that we have in the United States was born out of that debate of states' rights versus a strong central government. You had people like Alexander Hamilton, who became known as Federalists. John Adams, George Washington was a Federalist, who advocated for strong central government that had a lot of power, and that the states were kind of secondary and subservient to that. People like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and others, James Monroe, were on the other side, the anti-federalists, who eventually become known as the Democratic Republicans, which eventually becomes the Democrat Party, were much more in favor of the states having a lot more local control and the government, the central government, being as weak as possible. And it is that core debate over the nature of the United States government that will define the first 100 years. Honestly, it's defined all of our politics, but defines that first 100 years. And the early Americans who formed the Constitution did not do us any favors by kicking the can down the road on the slavery issue. And that becomes the defining political issue of the first 80, 90 years of the U.S. government, is dealing with the slavery issue and kind of kicking it down the road a little further and coming up with temporary compromises.
And the biggest question of them all was slavery, an ugly mark on what should have been a revolutionary new nation based on liberty and democracy. Thomas Jefferson had written a condemnation of slavery in the Declaration of Independence, but out of fear of losing Southern states' support, it was removed. Hey guys, do you think leaving this a little vague will create any unforeseen problems in the future? Cannonball! And those unforeseen problems were now beginning to rear their ugly heads. As the nation developed, the North and the South developed along two very different lines, and two very different cultural identities emerged. Northern cities began rapidly industrializing, while the southern climate allowed for large plantations of labor-intensive crops. As a result, one half of the country didn't rely on slaves, while the other half had become economically dependent on them. In 1793, Eli Whitney's cotton gin caused the slave trade in the South to explode, while in the North, a growing abolitionist movement was taking root. A general mistrust began to develop between the North and the South.
So Eli Whitney's cotton gin basically keeps slavery alive to the degree that it was, because cotton was, as he mentioned, a very labor-intensive crop. and it was expensive to grow cotton because of how much time it took to separate the seed. I think it was separate the seeds from the cotton once it had been picked. The cotton gin made it very easy and quick to process cotton. And so it made slavery a valuable commodity, because now you could have a bunch of slaves out in the field that could rapidly pick the cotton and you could process it fast. And so it made slavery viable again. And so even as the slave trade itself, the import of new slaves, gets stopped, I think 20 years into the U.S. history. So right around 1808, 1809, 1810, somewhere in there, the slave trade was abolished. Now that means that the slaves that already exist are even more valuable, because you can't get new ones except to have them produce children. And so that kept it alive and made it the dominant issue. I think maybe a lot of the founding fathers rightfully thought that it would die a slow death and kind of phase out over time, but they didn't anticipate the cotton gin.
As Northerners felt the South were hell-bent on expanding slavery, and fear spread throughout the South that the North wanted to take their slaves away. In 1819, there were 11 free states and 11 slave states. A perfect balance. A happy medium. A harmonious relationship. Hey guys, nice to meet you. I'm Missouri, and I would like to become the 23rd state. Hey buddy, welcome to the nation. We'll be happy to accept you as a free state. Oh no, you don't. You're trying to get one over on us. Missouri's gonna be a slave state. Okay, listen, why don't we just ask Missouri what it wants to be, and we slave state... Well, then,
Maine.
Allow me to introduce to you the newest, freshest state on the scene. Maine. Hey, you can't do that, and you can't have any more slave states above this line. What?
Yeah, so Maine, up until that point, had been a part of Massachusetts. And so they broke it off as a separate state. And yeah, this is going to define... all the way from 1789, when Washington becomes president, up to the 1860 election, the defining issue is going to be the balance of free and slave states. If you're not familiar with our government in the United States, each state gets 2 senators, regardless of population, regardless of size. And so to keep the balance in the Senate, so that no laws could be passed that would favor one side over the other, they constantly were keeping that balance between states that allowed slavery and states that didn't. And so part of the Missouri Compromise is admitting Maine, but then drawing this line and saying we can't have any more slave states above that line, but that only lasts a little while.
The issue of slavery is solved, and it will never come up again. A few years later, it came up again. You see, as America expanded westward, each new state or territory that was added threatened to upend the delicate balance between the slave and free states. If one faction managed to outnumber the other, it could gain an easy majority and force its own ideals on the opposing side, leaving a huge portion of the population feeling spiteful and oppressed. For a while, compromises kicked the can down the road and kept the volatile balance in check, as new free and slave states were roughly added in pairs. But then one loudmouth state just had to barge in and ruin everything as usual. The addition of Texas saw the United States enter into a war with Mexico, which they won, gaining a huge amount of land out west.
And that had been the plan all along. James Polk, who becomes president, was pretty clear that he wanted to annex Texas. And Texas wanted to be a part of the United States all the way back to 1836 when they had won their independence. But the issue was admitting Texas as a slave state, which is interesting because Texas had originally been part of Mexico, which outlawed slavery in its constitution. So Texas wanted to admit it as a slave state, but there was no free state that could be admitted at that time to balance it out. And so it didn't happen for a while. So it's a good 10 years later before it's finally admitted. And admitting Texas as a slave state kicks off the Mexican-American War and kicks up this issue once again,
creating even more problems. Hey guys, nice to meet you. I'm California, and I would like to become the 31st state. Hey buddy, welcome to the nation. We'll be happy to accept you as a southern slave state. Oh no, you don't. You're trying to get one over on us. California's gonna be a free state. Okay, listen, why don't we just ask California what it wants to be, and we can free state. Well, then, allow me to introduce to you the territories of New Mexico and Utah, able to freely vote for slavery themselves. Hey, you can't do that! And we can enter Northern Territory anytime we want to recapture escaped slaves. What? The issue of slavery is solved, and it will never come up again.
So the Fugitive Slave Act was very controversial, especially in the North. What it meant was that, up until this point, if a slave, a runaway slave, could make it into a northern free state, there was a relatively good chance that they were going to remain free. The Fugitive Slave Act allowed Southern pursuers to go into Northern Territory to get their contraband or the runaway slaves back, their property as they saw it. And the Northern authorities were obligated by the Fugitive Slave Act to aid them in that. And people could be arrested and prosecuted for harboring and protecting slaves. So now freed slaves or runaway slaves had to get all the way to Canada to really be able to have freedom. And so this was a big, big deal. And this kind of really starts to push things toward the American Civil War and kind of up the violence and up the anger that's being felt on both sides.
A few years later, it came up again. In 1854, a Democratic senator from Illinois wanted to build a really cool choo-choo train here and proposed that the territories of Kansas and Nebraska be created open to slavery, even though they were clearly above the Missouri Compromise line. Obviously, the northern states were like, hell no. But the Southern Democrats who controlled Congress at the time were like, well, if you love liberty and democracy so much, then you should let them vote on whether slavery should be legal or not. And so it was. Huge numbers of pro- and anti-slavery settlers rushed to Kansas to sway the vote in their favor.
And so this becomes kind of the preview of the American Civil War, because you've got people from both sides flocking to Kansas so that their side will win the debate. So on both sides, the North and the South, this isn't just about self-determination anymore. It's about pushing their agenda. It's about making their agenda show up in other places. So, for a guy in Arkansas who's pro-slavery, it's not enough that Arkansas has slavery. Now he wants to make sure that when Kansas enters the Union, it has slavery too. And for somebody in Illinois who may be pro-Union and or anti-slavery, they're going to come to Kansas, try to build up those numbers and do the same thing. And of course, it inevitably leads to violence.
And while they were all there, they began to beat the crap out of each other. One of those settlers was a man named John Brown, a former businessman who failed at just about everything he tried and went arguably insane. He was a radical abolitionist and dedicated much of his life to the Underground Railroad and freeing slaves. One night, in revenge for an earlier raid by pro-slavery forces, he and his sons killed a number of pro-slavery settlers in the territory, helping to kickstart years of violence known as Bleeding Kansas.
And interesting, John Brown and his family actually at one time lived nearby to the Grant family. So Ulysses S. Grant's family knew John Brown's family when they all lived, I think, in Ohio together. And John Brown, he was as radical as they come. And of course, he's going to be one of the events that leads up to the Civil War.
Kansas and Nebraska both eventually voted in favor of outlawing slavery. But from here, the tension began to grow at a rapid pace. In 1852, author Harriet Beecher Stowe penned Uncle Tom's Cabin, a best-selling novel that exposed the terrible cruelty of slavery to the world. Oh, how awful. How morally corrupt a nation must be to allow such things to happen. So,
Queen Victoria, where slavery had been illegal at one time.
Your Majesty, what should we do about all the starving children working in the coal mines? Nothing! In 1854, the Republican Party was formed, and Abraham Lincoln emerged as a leading figure. Southern Democrats viewed the new Republican Party with mistrust, believing it to be radical and abolitionist.
So, the Republican Party is born at a time when there really is no opposition to the Democratic Party. There had been the Whigs, but the Whigs had kind of died out over time, and so the Republican Party is formed from a number of groups. And among those groups are pro-union, but anti-slavery, former Whigs. There are also a lot of other groups that come into that as well, but there's also a very radical wing, which come to be known as the Radical Republicans, which are the ones who aren't just opposed to the expansion of slavery as people like Abraham Lincoln are, but are absolutely outspoken in their opposition to slavery itself. And so when you have a new party that's never had power before, the Southern Democrats are looking at this and they're seeing the most extreme part of the wing of the party, and they're attributing that extremity to everybody. And we do this today, right? We judge our opposition by their most extreme and most outspoken members rather than how many of the other people might be. And Abraham Lincoln was a moderate Republican compared to most of them. The first time that they run a candidate for the presidency is 1856. John C. Fremont is the Republican nominee for president. He doesn't win. But 4 years later, Lincoln comes along. And in this speech called the Cooper Union speech, which he gives in New York City. He was very widely praised for the way he spoke, for the way he captured the audience, for the things that he said. And that really, that along with the Lincoln-Douglas debates when he and Stephen Douglas are running for the Illinois Senate, or the U.S. Senate seat from Illinois, that's what really brings him to national prominence.
In 1856, a politician named Charles Sumner gave a speech in Congress, calling out slave-owning Democrats with fiery language. If slavery was a woman, she'd be an ugly one. And the senator from South Carolina would like to boink her. Representative Brooks, do you have a rebuttal? Oh, I have a rebuttal, all right. Yeah, here's a rebuttal for you. Oh, come on. Surely this isn't allowed. I don't know. I'll have to consult the rulebook.
And by the way, I believe this painting on the wall, that's the Marquis de Lafayette when he was older. So I was sitting there looking at that, trying to remember who it was, but that's Lafayette.
I can't find anything about caning a political opponent, but it says here I'm not allowed to wear women's underwear. Uh-oh. News of the violence on the Senate floor took the nation by storm. Southern slave owners sent Representative Brooks new canes to replace his now broken one. And on the floors of Congress, politicians carried weapons in self-defense.
So you think that things are ugly now in politics? You know, a congressman literally caned a member of the U.S. Senate, beat him half to death on the floor of the Senate. That's how ugly things were getting. It was really, really ugly. And like they said, people are starting to carry weapons. I mean, it really is going down a very ugly path at this point. And we had a series of very weak presidents at this time that really did very little to deal with the issue. People like Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan.
Which is never a good sign. In 1857, the Supreme Court ruled in the Dred Scott case that all people of African descent, slave or free, could not be citizens, and therefore could not sue for their own freedom under any circumstances.
So Dred Scott is a freed slave who I believe is living in the St. Louis area. I think he was in Illinois, so he was in free territory. And he's actually buried in St. Louis. And this decision, I think in 1857, really, I think, solidified anger in the North toward the South, when they basically said because of the color of your skin and because of where you come from, even if you were born in this country, you have no rights to citizenship whatsoever.
Undoing years of progress with the strike of a gavel. Now, within all this bitter debate over slavery, there were many nuances. North versus South, Republican versus Democrat, states versus the federal government. But let's strip all of that away. For 4 million individuals living in America, this wasn't about political intrigue or party alignment. It was about the basic human right to be free. Men, women, and children were stolen from their homelands and brought to the American continent.
All right, and I'm going to pause right there because in the original video when I did this, one of the most common comments I got from people was, they weren't stolen from their homeland, they were sold into slavery by other Africans. Yes, that was often the case. It doesn't matter. I don't know why this has to be such a big deal that we have to go out of our way to point out that slavery involved other Africans. We get it. It doesn't matter how these people ended up in chains, loaded on ships, and transported across an ocean to serve as slaves for generations. It doesn't matter how they got there. The fact is that millions of people were being held against their will as slavery, as property, with no free will whatsoever, with no ability to make their decisions, no ability to keep their families together. They could be separated, they could be beaten. They had no rights to appeal things that were done to them. They had no rights to citizenship. It doesn't matter how they got there. They got there.
For generations, they were considered to be property, forced to live in poverty, and work from sunrise to sunset. Plantation overseers did whatever they felt was necessary to get the most out of their slaves. Punishments were often barbaric. Families were regularly separated, and parents could often only watch, as their children were auctioned off, never to be seen again.
Put yourself in that position. Slave or not, imagine having no power over whether or not somebody takes your child away and sells them to someone else, takes your wife away and sells them, and you never see them again, and there's not a darn thing you can do about it. That's an important reminder. These were the lives of human beings who we claimed in our own Declaration of Independence had the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These people didn't have that right.
Thousands of slaves took the treacherous risk of running away, and abolitionists in the North helped many escape via the Underground Railroad as bounty hunters entered the North to chase them down. Leading figures within the abolitionist movement included many significant free black men and women. But it's important to note that for many of the anti-slavery white individuals in the North, opposition to slavery was often an economic issue, not a moral one, as many worried large plantations would take their lands and livelihoods away.
And let's be honest, even some of the most prominent anti-slavery people in the North, by our standards today, would be white supremacists and racists. Many of them, even though they may have been pushing for the freedom of slaves, did not view slaves as equals, did not view African Americans as equal to white people. And many of them, while they may have been morally opposed to slavery, did not necessarily speak out against slavery for economic reasons. They're going to come and take our jobs, that kind of thing. Or what do we do with them? People like Abraham Lincoln wanted to set up colonies, supported the colonies in places like Monrovia, Liberia, in Western Africa, sending them back. Lincoln tried to set up a colony in Central America where they would send freed slaves, believing, and fairly so, that black people would have a very difficult time having equality with white people in the United States.
Abraham Lincoln knew that slavery was a moral evil, and he regularly spoke out against it in powerful speeches that helped him rise through the ranks of the new Republican Party. He lamented at the hypocrisy of a great American nation meant to stand as a shining beacon of freedom, while also enslaving 4 million men, women, and children. He most famously declared in 1858 that a house divided against itself cannot stand, that one day slavery in America would end.
And he was quoting the Bible when he said that. He was quoting Jesus. Jesus was the one who said that first when he was being accused of being demon-possessed. And he said that, Satan can't fight against Satan, a house divided against itself cannot stand, all that stuff.
However, even Lincoln was cautious in his opposition. He didn't want to outlaw it entirely, but simply prevent its expansion, so that given enough time, he believed it would naturally die out. Thankfully, history would force his hand. In October 1859, one abolitionist decided he'd try to single-handedly take down slavery by force.
John Brown.
He would be crazy enough to even attempt such a thing. It's our good friend, John Brown. He planned to seize arms from an armory in the town of Harper's Ferry, free the slaves there, and continue south, inciting a major slave uprising along the way. A noble cause, a bad plan, and terrible execution. Brown's men took the armory and some hostages, but were quickly surrounded by one Robert E. Lee and his U.S. Marines.
Yeah, and Lee wasn't actually in command normally of U.S. Marines. I believe he actually commanded a cavalry regiment. But they sent him because obviously he was like one of the U.S. top commanders at that time. And so he was sent with this detachment of Marines to put down this rebellion in Harper's Ferry.
Brown was captured, and a couple of months later, he was executed for treason. Northerners sympathized with Brown, but Southerners were like, "You see this? They're coming for us. Soon, there'll be 1 million John Browns." 1 million John Browns? What on earth are you thinking about? A John Brown farm? Yeah, me too. To make matters worse, new northern free states meant now the southern states really were outnumbered, and they were beginning to feel bitterly spiteful and oppressed. Further fear began to spread in the South when news broke that a relatively unknown figure had just secured the Republican Party nomination for president.
And you want a good story, I highly recommend. It's a really long book, but it's called Team of Rivals. By Doris Kearns Goodwin, and it's about Abraham Lincoln, and a lot of it covers what happened at the Republican convention. You got to remember, at this time in history, the nomination process was very different than it is today. You didn't have primaries in all the states where people got to vote on the candidate they wanted, and that's how you elected your Republican nominee. This was all done by party officials at the convention, and very often they went into the convention having no idea who the nominee was going to be. And so going into the Republican convention, which I believe was in Illinois that year, you had all these factions supporting different candidates. A lot of them supported Seward. Some of them were supporting the governor of Pennsylvania. Some of them were supporting some other folks, and I think Salmon P. Chase from Ohio was one of the people that had a lot of support. But they all had strong support, but not enough support. And so you had all these different factions, and none of them could agree on a candidate. And so Abraham Lincoln, who isn't at the convention, but he's kind of staying in communication with his people there, very shrewdly starts making connections with all these different factions. And while they would never say so publicly, probably made some promises to people. And so Lincoln kind of becomes everybody's favored second choice. And so he eventually gets the support of Pennsylvania's faction, probably with the promise that Pennsylvania's governor would be given a cabinet position, which he was, Simon Cameron. And so eventually he gets the nomination a couple ballots later. And then he does an incredibly brilliant thing, and he starts taking all of these former rivals, people who thought they were going to get the Republican nomination, and he puts them in his cabinet. Number one, where he can see them and keep an eye on them, but also because he recognized that these were people who were good at what they did, and he could use their help. But these were also people who thought they could do the job better than Lincoln, and didn't think very highly of Abraham Lincoln, but in most cases he won them over, and they became his staunchest allies and supporters.
Abraham Lincoln, mostly well-liked among anti-slavery Northerners, had made some of the most powerfully worded speeches against slavery of any politician at the time. And now, there was a chance that he, and his cheekbones, could become president. For the South, that would be too much. In the 1860 election, Lincoln's name didn't even appear on the ballot in 10 southern states. But much to their horror, when the final results came in, Lincoln had won by an electoral college landslide.
Yeah, so that you can see the Democrats actually split. They can't agree on a candidate. And so unlike the Republicans who compromised on Abraham Lincoln, they don't have a compromise. And so you have Stephen Douglas for the Northern Democrats, Breckinridge, who was the sitting vice president at the time for the Southern Democrats, and then you have John Bell over there for the Constitutional Union Party. And so all of these votes kind of get split between all these candidates. Now, a common misconception is that the only reason Abraham Lincoln won this election is because those three candidates split the anti-slavery vote. But here's the catch about this. If you added up all of their votes together and put them on one candidate, Lincoln still narrowly wins the election. If you look at the states that he won, he still would have gotten a majority of the Electoral College votes. Now, that doesn't mean that had there been one strong candidate, Lincoln still would have won, because some of those votes might have gone differently, but it wasn't quite as clear-cut as sometimes people spin it to be.
Lincoln himself tried to calm their fear. How many times do I have to tell you, I'm not gonna take away your slaves? Yeah, right, Honest Abe. We've had enough of you Northerners. We're gonna go form our own country. You can't do that. Why not? Well, if you had won the election, would it be okay for us to leave? Of course not. Well, why not? Because that's not how victim mentality works. Many states felt that when they joined the Union, they always withheld the right to leave it whenever they pleased. Many people living in 19th century America often felt more loyalty to their state than to the nation.
And it's not just often, that was most of the time. And that goes right up through the Civil War. People did feel much more loyalty to their state than they did to the federal government. You have to remember, there wasn't quite the sense of identity with the nation that people had then. This isn't a time when people are connected like they are today. And so most of what they knew was their local community and their local culture and their local government. And they often, when they referred to my country, they were actually talking about their state. And the loyalty ran deep to that. And almost to a man, if you look at the prominent Civil War generals in the South, people like Robert E. Lee, Longstreet, Jackson, others, their loyalty, they felt, lie first to their state. And so, for example, for Lee, if Virginia had stayed in the Union, Lee would have stayed in the Union. That's just the reality. That's how they viewed things.
And now, with the South feeling like it had lost its voice in the federal government, they were out of here. South Carolina was the first to go, and over a period of 6 months, one by one, 11 slave states officially seceded from the Union.
Now, there's a very interesting line of demarcation that you can make here, and it's right in here. you can see the difference between when the Southern or the Deep South or the what they sometimes call the Cotton States, when they seceded, and when Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas seceded. All of these happened after the Civil War actually had already begun. And they were much more on the fence because slavery was not nearly as essential to the economy of these states. And all of these states had very prominent local regions that were pro-union and did not have a lot of slavery. Eastern Tennessee is a prime example. Throughout the war, Eastern Tennessee was very pro-union. So they didn't rely quite as heavily on slavery in their economies. To them, they probably viewed this much more as Northern aggression, the North telling the South what to do. When Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers to put down the Southern Rebellion after Fort Sumter had been fired on by Beauregard's troops in South Carolina, to them that was the final straw. I'm not suggesting that it was a valid argument, and I'm not suggesting slavery didn't play a role. I'm saying that's how they spun things.
With just 4 contested border states opting to remain, the seceding states issued a number of official documents justifying their secession. South Carolina proclaimed that it was northern states' hostility to slavery that rendered the federal government illegitimate. Mississippi declared that their position was thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, and in a speech, the Confederate vice president stated that the new Confederate government rested upon what he called the great truth of racial inequality.
So this is absolutely true, and this is one of the things you'll often hear me talk about when it comes to the American Civil War. There is zero denying that the political movement behind the Confederacy, behind secession, the leaders of the secession movement, the politicians, the people in charge, were 100% doing this because of their desire to preserve the institution of slavery. Absolute. There's no debate about that. But like in any war, there's a difference between what the political leader's agenda is and what the common soldier's agenda is. The majority of people in the South did not own slaves. That's just the reality. There were a lot of different reasons why people fought for the Confederacy. Preserving the institution of slavery was one. States' rights was another one. Feeling like the North shouldn't tell us what to do. We should be able to self-determine, even though the states' rights issue happened to be slavery. Or just, hey, they're down here and they're invading us and I'm protecting my home. The vast majority of Confederate soldiers, none of them owned slaves. Now, you can argue that they were still protecting that institution by being in the war and things like that, but remember, a lot of them were conscripted too. So there's a lot of nuance to this. There's a lot of depth to this issue. It's not just as simple as slavery or states' rights. It's all of the above. It's any and all of those things. But the major political issue is slavery.
Revered American generals, such as Robert E. Lee, opted to side with their states over the Union. And with all the chaos, one New York lawyer wrote that rather than a bald eagle, America's national bird should be a debilitated chicken. And hey, I kind of like that. One man, watching the crisis unfold, knew it would be his job to solve it. Lincoln was just about to hop on a train and become the President of the United States of America. Hey man, you're hella ugly. Grow a beard or something
Grace
to hide
Bedell.
that face. Good idea. Still ugly.
Totally how it happened, too. This little girl writes him a letter and says that he should grow some whiskers. And so by the time he shows up in Washington to take office as president, he started to grow a beard.
With assassination plots already underway, Lincoln had to travel to Washington, D.C. under heavy disguise and protection. All along the way, he received stacks of threatening letters. May the hand of the devil strike you down. You are destroying this country. Damn you, every breath you take. Love from Grandma. At his inauguration speech, Lincoln once again reiterated that no, I do not want to take away anyone's slaves. But for Lincoln, he did want to preserve the Union. He declared secession to be nothing but an illegitimate rebellion. In your hands and not in mine, he said, is the momentous issue of civil war. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. We are not enemies, but friends.
And Lincoln was very adamant in making sure that the South fired the first shots of the war. He was not going to allow himself to be viewed as the aggressor, so he wanted to have that moral high ground. So he resupplies Fort Sumter, which is commanded by Major Robert Anderson. The second in command is Abner Doubleday, who a lot of people mistakenly credit with inventing baseball. He didn't. But he resupplies the fort, and he decides to make that the place that he's going to make a firm stand and say no more. And I get people who comment and say, hey, but wait a second, South Carolina, the state of South Carolina built Fort Sumter with their expenses. They had every right to take it back. Well, here's the issue with that. They ceded the deed to that fort to the federal government years before that. So if you're going to argue that South Carolina had the right to take the fort back because they built it, that would be like me saying I built a house with my own money. I transferred the deed to another family, and 20 years later I decided that I could grab some guns and take it back by force because it was rightfully mine because I had built it. That's not how life works.
It was clear Lincoln was ready and willing to get freaky and open up a can of Scatman John if he had to. Whether he had the support of the people, however, was in question. In the end, it was the Confederates that fired the first shot. As they seceded, the Confederate states began seizing federal U.S. property throughout the South. Off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina, was one such federal property, Fort Sumter, held by a measly, undersupplied U.S. force. The Confederate militia there demanded the fort surrender, a request which was quickly denied, and any remaining hope for a peaceful solution to the secession crisis probably then died when the Confederates did this. The Battle of Fort Sumter is considered to be the beginning of the American Civil War. Many of the Confederates there also considered it to be the end of the American Civil War. They hoped Old Abe would just sigh and say, okay, you win. Unfortunately for them, Lincoln actually said, you're about to get a roundhouse to the face.
Abraham Lincoln, probably. So the first deaths in the American Civil War then are not during the bombardment of Fort Sumter. They're during the surrender. They fired a cannon as part of the ceremony lowering the American flag, and it kind of was faulty and it exploded, and those were the first deaths of the American Civil War.
Lincoln sent out the call for 75,000 volunteers, and men signed up in droves, hopeful for some adventure and good old-fashioned F-U-N. In the new Confederate capital at Richmond, Virginia, Confederate President Jefferson Davis and his cheekbones had also sent out the call for 100,000 men. As ever, both sides hoped for a quick end to the war. Is it over yet? No, Jimmy, it's been 1 week. Is it over now? No. How about now? If you ask that one more time, I swear I will turn this army around and you'll all have to go back home to your wives and children.
So, yeah, absolutely true. Everybody thought it was going to be a quick war. Everybody thought it would be over with one big battle and that would be it, and everybody'd go home and they'd find a compromise. They really had no idea just how brutal this thing was going to be.
Particular, the South knew the conflict would pose a bit of a challenge. How can we expect to win with a population of only 5 million against 22 million in the North? If you count us 4 million slaves, you'd have 9 million. Great idea! Hand these rifles out to all them. Wait a minute. You almost had me there. The problem for Lincoln was that many of his top generals were getting old and were being a bit too cautious. The commanding general was a man named Winfield Scott, a veteran of the Mexican-American War, and by now, he was too fat to even mount a horse. Okay, chaps, we need to come up with a plan. Hit.
It wasn't just that. The man was like 70 years old. This was a guy that was a veteran of the War of 1812. So, he was not going to command an army in the field.
We could wait for the Confederates to come and apologize. Maybe we should all sit in a circle and discuss our feelings. Crossing the Delaware into New Jersey worked for me. Those are all terrible ideas. And you? Wrong video. Hey, I'm the greatest president in the history of this nation. Yeah, we'll see about that, dingus. Eventually, Lincoln's generals came up with a multi-pronged strategy. First, a blockade would cut off and starve the South of supplies by sea. Secondly, taking control of the Great Mississippi River would sever the South's economic artery while splitting it in two. And finally, a main Union force in the east would move south and take the Confederate capital, ending the war. Bada boom, bada bing. Skirmishes began to break out across the nation, and the Union Army in the east began to move south towards Richmond. Everything seemed to be going well until they reached Manassas, where they came upon a large Confederate force. It's almost like they were waiting for us. How did they know? As it turned out, spies in DC had sent a coded message to the Confederates warning of the invasion. Did you use NordVPN? What the heck is NordVPN?
So yeah, one of the spies was a woman by the name of Rose O'Neill Greenhow, and people don't talk a lot about this aspect of the war, but some of the earliest stuff that happens has to do with espionage. And the movement south, everybody expected it, so it's not like this was a huge spy network victory kind of thing where, oh my gosh, there's a Union army moving south. Everybody knew that was going to happen. It was just the timing of it and where and when and how that was going to happen. And that gave precious time for the Confederates. The Confederates had, you have to think of it this way, in the East there are basically four armies, four main bodies of troops. The Confederates have two. They have an Army of the Potomac. Yes, the Confederates were the Army of the Potomac. That's in northeastern Virginia. Up around Harper's Ferry, you have the Army of the Shenandoah under Joe Johnston. And then you have the Department of Pennsylvania under Patterson. That's up in the Harper's Ferry area. And then you have Irvin McDowell with the Army of Northeastern Virginia for the Union. And so you have these four bodies. And so McDowell's moving with his body, but Patterson's force stays up around Harper's Ferry watching Johnston's force. Well, Johnston loads his men on trains and gets them to Manassas Junction in time to turn the tide of the battle. And so for that reason, having that intelligence and knowing what was going on did, in fact, turn the tide of the battle. Now I think we're going to watch an ad about NordVPN.
I'm so glad you asked. Do you use the internet? Me too. Do you like internet safety? Me too. Hey, we should hang out sometime so I can tell you about NordVPN. NordVPN has over 5,000 secure and super fast servers in 60 countries that allow you to surf the net safely without personal data logging. Not only does it help you stay secure, but with just a click of a button, you can take a quick trip to Sweden and enjoy some Nordic crime dramas. Is there some amazing content on YouTube that's still blocked in your country? Not to fear. NordVPN is here. NordVPN gives you access to all of these amazing features, and it has a 30-day money-back guarantee. So click the link in the description below, nordvpn.com/oversimplified, and use promo code Oversimplified to get 70% off an annual subscription. That's only $3.49 a month, plus an additional month for free. Again, that's nordvpn.com/oversimplified. And as always, you'll be supporting my channel. So thank you. Now where were we? Oh yeah, secession, Fat Man, and the Union invasion into Virginia. The two sides encountered each other at Manassas, and both geared up for the first major battle of the Civil War, the First Battle of Bull Run. The Confederates rapidly brought in support via rail, and the two sides were about equal in numbers. However, they were also equally inexperienced.
Yeah, and so if you're not familiar with the American Civil War, you may wonder why often these battles have two different names. In the South, they tended to name the battle, this is not a 100% rule, but they tended to name the battle by a nearby place, like a town. So you have, for example, the Battle of Manassas in the South, because Manassas Junction was the nearest town. The North tended to name them by a nearby body of water, the Battle of Bull Run. There are some exceptions to this. Battle of Shiloh was named after a church by the Union, but the Confederates called it Pittsburgh Landing by the landing on the Tennessee River that was there. But a lot of these battles follow that rule. Battle of Murfreesboro is the Battle of Stones River. Sometimes they both name it the same thing, like Gettysburg or Chickamauga was named the same on both sides.
A large number of civilians also rode out by carriage from DC to picnic on the nearby hills and watch the excitement unfold. Nobody seemed to quite understand how destructive this war was going to be. The Union forces pulled a flanking maneuver to hit the Confederates on their left, and the two sides fired on each other in rows. Farm families living in the area were forced to flee the fighting, including a man named Wilmer McLean. Hurry up, Martha! There's a war out here! The more you tell me to hurry up, the slower I will go! The Union force saw initial success, pushing the Confederates back to Henry Hill.
And more about Wilmer McLean later, because it was Wilmer McLean, whose farm was part of the first Bull Run battlefield, whose parlor will be the site of the surrender of Robert E. Lee at Appomattox in April of 1865. He tried to get away from the war, and he often would say that the war began in his backyard and it ended in his parlor, which is really kind of true. The Union's winning a lot of success early on, and like he said, these are green units. Most of these men have never been in combat before. There's a lot of friendly fire that happens because you have like a Wisconsin unit wearing gray, you have a bunch of Confederate units wearing blue, and it gets really confusing on battlefields anyway. and more so in this battle where nobody's got experience and a lot of people are wearing kind of very distinct uniforms that they can't tell which side they're on. And they drive them off of Matthews Hill. I have a video where I visited the Bull Run battlefield and talk a lot about what happened here.
But one as of yet fairly unknown General Thomas Jackson had arrived, and he took a defensive position, standing firm like a stone wall, holding the Union Army off, and finally sending them running back to Washington, D.C. With heavy casualties, the sobering reality of war hit both sides hard, and the North, having just lost the first major battle, had to face the serious prospect that they may not actually win this war. President Lincoln, General Jackson whipped us so hard, the Confederates are calling him Stonewall Jackson. Wait, that's why they're calling him that? Not because he looks like he ran face first into a stone wall?
So the story goes that Bernard B., who was in command of troops on Henry House Hill, is trying to rally his men, and Jackson had just arrived with his brigade of Virginians. And the story, the most often told version of the story, is that Bernard B. is trying to rally his men, and he says, "Look, men, there stands Jackson like a stone wall. Let us determine to die here, and we will conquer. Rally behind the Virginians." Some people, a minority of people, claim he was actually insulting Stonewall Jackson. And Jackson, for the rest of his life, which was only about 2 years, would say that the name rightfully belonged to the brigade and not to him personally. And they did call it the Stonewall Brigade from that time after.
Apparently not. Worse yet, the North had also lost the first major battle out west, giving away control of southwest Missouri. All of this was terrible news for Abraham Lincoln, especially since many of his generals and cabinet already didn't have much respect for him. They felt he was incapable of running a war, because he seemed a bit like your friendly old grandpa. He famously loved a long-winded story and a good pun. "I've been so busy, my wife is missing me, but her aim is starting to improve." But deep down, few realized he could also be incredibly shrewd. Oh, Abe, you're so funny.
One of the most brilliant politicians we've ever had. People don't really know that about Lincoln all that much. Yeah, Lincoln is the folksy leader, you know, the martyred leader of the American Civil War, the uniter of the country, the great emancipator, all that stuff. He was a brilliant politician. He knew how to play the game of politics and play it well. He knew how to get what he wanted. He knew how to bend the Constitution just enough without going too far and incurring the wrath of the Supreme Court too much. He knew how to keep a coalition together, do just enough to kind of keep the war Democrats on his side, all of those things. He was brilliant at that.
Funny how? Funny like I'm a clown? Abe, I was just... No, funny how? Like I'm here to amuse you? During the war, Lincoln committed acts that were viewed by some as impeachable. His administration suppressed the free media from printing articles sympathetic towards the South. Some Southern sympathizers were even arrested without a trial. Lincoln's criticizers began accusing him of being a tyrant. But to quote the man himself, "Hey, it's war, baby. What are you gonna do?" By the end of 1861, with things already looking bad for the North, abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass couldn't believe that the Union Army weren't enlisting black men. He continued to put pressure on Lincoln to make the war about emancipation. "Mr. President, it's time to make the war about emancipation." I don't want to ruffle any feathers. The feathers are already ruffled.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. It was never that Lincoln was not... I mean, it wasn't that Lincoln was against the idea of freeing the slaves. It's just that he didn't think it was politically possible. You saw the environment going into the 1860 election. He just didn't think that was an option. So now he sees it as an option. And he starts small. He starts by using it as a war measure. And, you know, there's a lot of depth to this conversation about this, more than I can get into right now. But he sees the opportunity and he jumps on it.
But Lincoln, hanging on to hope for a quick end to the conflict, continued to fight only for the preservation of the Union. It was decided, however, that escaped slaves from the Confederacy could be held as enemy contraband, and many of these men were put to work bolstering the Union's infrastructure and supply lines. Hoping to get things moving, Lincoln made young General George McClellan the new commanding general, and McClellan began to train up his men. He thought a lot of himself, however, and believed he was going to be the nation's great savior. And like many others, he didn't approve of the president's handling of the war. On one occasion, Lincoln went to McClellan's house to meet with him, but McClellan was late returning home. He kept the president waiting, and when he finally got there, he just straight up went to bed.
It legit happened exactly like that. And if you look at McClellan's letters to his wife, He had zero respect for Abraham Lincoln, called him a baboon, just repeatedly insulted him. He was an incredibly arrogant man for a guy who accomplished very little on the battlefield.
Now that's what I call disrespectful. McClellan talked the talk, but could he walk the walk? No. Like Lincoln's other generals, McClellan was maddeningly cautious. Hey man, could you move south and attack the enemy? What? Are you crazy? What if they have a big scary army down there? They probably do. What? Oh my gosh! McClellan worried that he did not have the numbers he needed to fight effectively. What if they have like 10,000 men? Okay, no problem. We'll get you 20,000 men. Well, what if they have 30,000 men? I'll need 40. Okay, you can have 40. Well, what if they have 50? I'll need 60. Lincoln tried, but it was all in vain. McClellan would not make a move for the rest of the year. The North's one saving grace for now was a general out west fighting in Kentucky and Tennessee, General Ulysses S. Grant. Cool, collected, methodical, and a big fan of whiskey. His chief of staff took it upon himself to keep Grant sober. One officer said that Grant habitually wore an expression as though he were determined to drive his head through a brick wall and was about to do it. And that determination led him to score a number of key victories when others around him were failing. At the Battle of Fort Donelson, Grant was like, "Why does Stonewall Jackson get a cool nickname and I don't? I want a cool nickname." "Sir, the Confederates say they're ready to surrender and want to know your terms." "No terms, just unconditional surrender." Hey, unconditional surrender Grant. That's a pretty cool nickname, right? Guys, right? Later in April 1862, the Confederates launched a sudden attack on Grant's army at Shiloh, but the determined, unconditional surrender Grant threw his lines at the rebels and sent them running. The battle resulted in the heaviest casualties in U.S. history so far, and despite...
Yeah, and by U.S. history, I mean, it's legit. I mean, the casualties at Shiloh at that point were basically equal to all the battle casualties in the previous wars. I mean, it was ridiculously high. We can look at it now and it doesn't seem that bad because we live on the other side of things like World War I and World War II, but at the time, you have to understand how massive these casualties were for the American people to read these things. At this point, they know the war is going to be long and bloody. Grant was an alcoholic. He absolutely was, and his alcoholism led him to have to resign from the Army as a captain in the 1850s. But he didn't drink all the time, and he most of the time drank when there was nothing else going on. It was usually when he was bored, usually when his wife wasn't around, and he had nothing else going on. When it came time for battle, he was almost always ready. So it wasn't as debilitating as some people might try to sell you that it was. Grant was also a first-class human being when it comes to character, and you'll hear me talk about him all the time. I highly recommend Ron Chernow's biography of Grant, as well as Grant's autobiography if you want to learn more.
his victory, Grant found himself under fire. You have to get rid of Grant. Why? Didn't he win? Yes, but he just threw his men at the enemy. Isn't that the point? Also, he's a loony drunk. Well, what does he like to drink? I believe whiskey, sir. Then send him more. Lincoln watched
Legit.
as his cabinet did nothing but bicker, and his generals did nothing. But then, worst of all, personal tragedy struck. Lincoln's young son, Willie, very much loved by the president, died of typhoid fever at the age of 11. Lincoln was a sensitive man and was heavily affected by the loss. His wife was inconsolable. But one of Lincoln's greatest traits, what made him such a great leader, was in the darkest of times, with composure and determination, he kept moving forward. He knew it was his responsibility to hold himself and his family together, and by doing so, he hoped to hold the nation together.
So the Lincolns had 4 sons in total. Eddie had died a few years earlier at a young age. Willie dies in 1862 in the White House. And Tad actually dies a few years after his father, leaving only Robert, the eldest remaining son. And you can understand why this was a lot for Mrs. Lincoln. She loses her husband to assassination. She loses 3 of her 4 sons by the time they're teenagers, and she ends up in an insane asylum because of it.
And he had it with McClellan's inaction. Lincoln decided he was going to take control. In March 1862, Lincoln firmly ordered McClellan to once again move south towards Richmond. McClellan insisted instead they move by sea to the Virginia Peninsula and attack Richmond from the southeast. Yes, said Lincoln. Okay, anything. Lincoln held on to some of McClellan's men to defend D.C. from a nearby Stonewall Jackson wreaking havoc in the Shenandoah Valley, and he sent McClellan south. McClellan landed on the peninsula, and he began to move inland. He came up against a small Confederate army that had dug in at Yorktown. McClellan vastly outnumbered the force, But it's said that Confederate General Magruder deceived McClellan by cleverly maneuvering his smaller force and making McClellan believe he faced a huge army.
He also took a bunch of logs and painted them to look like artillery pieces. So yeah, there was a big deception thing going on here.
No, you have way more men than them. Move forward. No. McClellan settled in for a month-long siege, giving time for Johnston to move south from Manassas and Magruder time to retreat. When he finally entered the city and found it deserted, he declared it a victory, calling his success brilliant. Then, after meeting some resistance at Williamsburg, McClellan moved to within just 20 miles of Richmond, his armies able to hear the church bells ringing in the enemy capital. You still outnumber them. Go give him hell. No. McClellan wants...
One of the key things about all of the movement for the Union armies during the Civil War, and I talk about this a lot as well, is that you have to remember that moving large numbers of troops, and we're talking often 100,000 men in a lot of these Virginia troop movements, moving large numbers of troops requires a lot of logistics. You're talking food, supply, ammunition, stuff to feed horses. I mean, all of this stuff has to go with an army. And so you have to stick close to supply lines. And so moving south from Washington, for example, they would have to stay close to the railroad, close to the rivers. Moving up the peninsula, they have to stay close to the James River where they can move supplies up the river to continually make sure the army has what it needs, whereas the Confederates don't have those logistical issues.
Once again held back, moving slowly and defensively, and with his army split in two, the Confederates saw an opportunity to strike back. McClellan's advance was halted, and now the Confederates pulled an ace out of their sleeve. General Lee, you're up. Do you think we should evacuate Richmond? No, Mr. President, no need.
So Lee, at this point, was not in command of any army in the field. He was in command of all Virginia forces, and he was basically an advisor to the president. And Joe Johnston gets wounded at the Battle of Seven Pines, and so that's when they throw Lee out there. And honestly, at the beginning, nobody in the Confederate Army thought too highly of Lee, and they weren't expecting a whole lot.
General Robert E. Lee, one of the most brilliant military commanders of the time, was now in charge. One of his biggest strengths was his ability to read the mind of his enemy, and he knew McClellan was cautious and weak. After moving Stonewall Jackson south to join him, and even though he had a smaller army, Lee hit McClellan in a series of fast-paced, close combat battles that had McClellan spooked. McClellan retreated the Union Army back again and again and again, escaping the peninsula and returning to D.C. Lee had defeated McClellan, and the campaign had failed.
And in those 7 days battles, very rarely did you have the entire Union Army in one place. Because of the rivers, because of the way they were spread out, most of these battles take place between Lee and a portion of the Union Army. And for a lot of those battles, McClellan wasn't even present. It was usually the corps commander for that particular unit. And I will say this, Stonewall Jackson often gets praised for his performance, and he had just come off of his brilliant performance in his Valley campaign, but Jackson did not perform particularly well in the 7 days battles.
Well, that was a major success. A success? Tell me exactly what was successful about that. Well, we successfully retreated. You lost. I didn't lose. I merely failed to win. Things just kept looking worse for the North. At least their Navy had seen some success, capturing a number of key port cities, notably when they steamrolled past Confederate forts to take New Orleans.
This is huge. New Orleans is by far the largest city in the South. I mean, it's like many times over larger than any other city in the South. It's the port of entry for a lot of supplies that have to get to places. And the Union takes it pretty much without a shot near the beginning of the war.
And speaking of the Navy, both sides had begun using ironclads. So that's pretty cool. But in the East, they still weren't having any luck. After McClellan's disastrous campaign, Lincoln briefly sent out one General John Pope to attack Northern Virginia. Hey man, just checking in. How's it going? Well, the Confederates kicked my butt at Cedar Mountain. Then they raided my camp and ran off with my money and clothes. Also, I appear to have been wedgied. Lee defeated Pope at yet another battle at Bull Run, in which nearby farm families once again got caught up in the fighting. Hurry up, Martha! There's another war out here! I'm waiting for my hair to dry! Wilmer McLean, sick of war, moved his family south, where he knew the war would definitely, absolutely, never touch him again. But Lincoln had yet another problem to contend with. European powers, in particular the UK, were looking increasingly like they may intervene diplomatically on the side of the Confederates. They were missing their precious supply of southern cotton because of the Union blockade, and they wanted to see a swift conclusion to the war. The tension between America and Great Britain had been increasing, especially after Confederate diplomats were discovered on a British ship. Now, after McClellan's failure to take Richmond, the UK declared it impossible for the North to win. Lincoln needed something to prevent Europe from getting involved, and after more petitioning from abolitionists, he decided maybe the time was finally right to make the war about ending the institution he hated, slavery. If the North had a noble cause to fight for, Europe would be less likely to intervene. But Lincoln and his cabinet knew before they could declare something as radical as emancipation, they needed a victory.
And, basically, it wasn't so much that it was radical, and that was why. It was because they had been losing the war. And Lincoln's cabinet very astutely pointed out, listen, if you put this out there now, it's going to seem like a desperate attempt to change things. It's going to seem like a last gasp of air before losing. We need to attach it to a victory. We need to basically negotiate from a position of strength is kind of the philosophy here. Do it from strength, not from weakness.
Especially now that the Confederates were about to go on the attack. Aware that he had a limited number of men and supplies, Lee now hoped that if he could just threaten Washington, D.C. militarily, he would gain Europe's recognition and crush Northern morale in time for the midterm elections, forcing the North to negotiate. With confidence at an all-time high, for the first time, Robert E. Lee invaded the North.
And again, a major issue here is the fact that the South was never going to win the war in a conventional manner. The same way the United States couldn't win a war by winning great victories on the battlefield repeatedly against the British in the American Revolution. The way the South was going to win the war was to outlast the American public, outlast the Union government and the Union Army until they would settle, they would sue for a negotiated peace. Get foreign powers on your side to help you diplomatically, financially, in terms of supplies, things of that nature. Hope all of the same conditions apply to the Confederacy that applied to the United States in the Revolutionary War. And so Lee is trying to force the issue. If he can win a great victory in the North, maybe the American public turns against the war. Maybe they elect the Democrats into Congress, and Lincoln doesn't have the support he needs to continue the fighting.
But on September 13th, the North finally had some luck. Oh boy, it's my lucky day. A cigar in a field. Hey, what's this wrapped around it? Oh my gosh! That's right, the North had discovered General Lee's battle plans wrapped around some cigars. And in them, they saw that Lee had split up his forces. McClellan headed out from D.C., and the two sides met in the Battle of Antietam, a crucial battle that would decide the course of the war. It saw the most vicious fighting to date, and still remains the single bloodiest day in American history.
And it's important to note that does not make it the bloodiest battle of the American Civil War. It was the bloodiest single day because this was a one-day battle. Gettysburg, Chickamauga, Chancellorsville, for example, were multi-day battles that had significantly more casualties but took place over several days. And of course, Antietam were counting both sides, Confederate and Union, in terms of the casualty figures to get those numbers. McClellan should have won a overwhelming victory. He could have destroyed Lee's army at Antietam. Lee had like 40,000 men at Antietam. It was one of the smallest armies he ever put into a major battle. McClellan had twice the number. He could have destroyed Lee's army, and he barely came out of there with a draw.
But for once, the North came out victorious, and Lee was forced to retreat. He's on the run. Chase him down and finish him off. No. You know what, old buddy, old pal? You're fired. The North had won their crucial victory. Lincoln breathed a huge sigh of relief, and with that win, he was prepared to take a huge step. On September 22nd, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. In January, all slaves held in the Confederate States would be, as far as the U.S. government was concerned, officially free. Throughout the North, free black men and women rejoiced, knowing that if the North were to win, their brothers and sisters would no longer be held in bondage. The proclamation also had the intended effect on Europe, who were not willing to oppose a pledge to end slavery. An outraged Confederacy knew that Lincoln had given the war a new meaning. It was no longer just about the preservation of the Union. Now, it was about creating a new Union, washed clean of its original sin. A Union without slavery.
Well, that's partially true, and the part about the diplomatic part of this is absolutely true. The European powers were not going to enter the war on the side of the Confederacy once the U.S. government made it about slavery, but The part about the Emancipation Proclamation being viewed as a permanent solution that rid the United States of slavery, absolutely not true at all. This was a war measure that freed slaves in the parts of the Union that were in rebellion against the United States. So basically the Confederacy. It was never going to hold up after the war was over. And there was a good chance that the Supreme Court could have gotten involved, ruled it unconstitutional, and at least theoretically ordered those people back into slavery. That was why Lincoln needed to get the 13th Amendment passed at the end of the war, to make sure that wouldn't be an issue. The 13th Amendment is what abolished slavery, not the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation changed the nature of the war, changed the aim of the war. For the first time, made it a war goal to end slavery, and gave people something new to fight for more than just preserving the Union. But it was a complicated thing that had no sure chance of being held up in court. And if you watch the movie Lincoln talks about the slippery slope that he was on with the Emancipation Proclamation and what might happen when the war was over. I highly recommend you check that out. All right, I've been going on and on and on. This is a crazy long video, I know, but I hope you've enjoyed it. I'll come back with my revamped part 2 tomorrow. Thanks so much for watching, guys.